Hi friends, it's me, Andrew Kolb, and this again is my voice. So what we're looking at here is a quick screen recording of a fiddler crab that I did for Light Gray Art Lab's Tiny Homes art show. So we might as well get started. So this was about a 45-minute to roughly an hour illustration condensed down here into just under 8 minutes. The brush that I'm using right now while I draw these eyes is Kyle T. Webster's Runny Inkers, or a brush from that pack. And as you can see, the first eye I drew and then duplicated and then slightly adjusted so that way they weren't exact copies of each other. So they're pretty much the same, but I like to have at least a bit of variation between two elements, so that way they're not identical, especially with kind of the flawed brushwork that kind of comes with the shape. I just prefer to not have an exact copy. Anyway, one thing that I'm doing now is I'm using a path to make the kind of whole of the shell with curves that I can't accomplish just through free arm movement and the Cintiq. I will make a path and then use that to either fill or apply a stroke to, so that way I can guarantee that I get the curve that I want. Case in point, as far as applying a stroke, that's what I'm about to do with these arms. So I'm drawing the path, and then in Photoshop you can just apply a stroke of any tool to that path. In the case of this, it was the brush. So what Photoshop does is it just takes the current running brush, which was about a 20 pixel runny inker, and applied that to the full stroke. So now what I'm doing is applying details. So I'm actually still using that same brush, but just decreased in size. I tried to limit myself, and I generally do this when I'm working with line work, limit myself to just a few sizes. So the large strokes are 20 pixel and the small details are 8 pixels. Similarly, these white shapes that I'm drawing now also use that same 20 pixel brush. And the reason why I do that is to try to create as much harmony within the illustration as possible. So as opposed to using the brush at a number of different sizes, I find that if I simplify, then it kind of creates a slightly more cohesive image. And the reason why I'm drawing these shapes freehand, or drawing the outlines freehand instead of using some sort of action or quick kind of expansion in Photoshop, is for the same reason that I tried to kind of work with these kind of slightly flawed brushes, or imperfect brushes. And that's because I try to make it kind of feel a bit more alive, or not quite as cold. Admittedly, I'm a little biased. I think the kind of vectors tend to feel a bit more mechanical, so I actively work against that. So by drawing these shapes freehand, what it does is, well, I mean, there's going to be human error. Like sometimes, as you can see, the border will go a bit farther out or kind of creep in a bit closer, but at the end of the day, it's still pretty consistent. What's happening now is I guess I should explain, those white shapes were drawn on a separate layer from the black outlines, and what I did with the layer for those white shapes is I locked the transparent pixels. So in Photoshop, in the layers palette, if you select a layer and then click on the little 3x3 grid beside the word lock, it'll allow you to only paint where artwork already exists. So I'm using Kyle Webster's dry media brush to apply texture and paint in onto those shapes. And I'm using that same brush now for drawing the shadow. And then once that's done, we're going to get into the texture of the shell. You'll notice a slight hue shift. I added a kind of a cream color that I multiplied onto the entire artboard. And now I'm copying in public domain images that I got from a few different resources. And I'm using a mask to kind of only allow those visuals to appear within the shape of the shell. And the images that I used more or less relate to travel or homes or protection or things that could attack something like a crab. So that way, conceptually, all of these kind of collaged images relate to each other. Since the theme of the show again is tiny homes, I want the kind of history of someone carrying their home on their back to be reflected in the texture of the shell. So a bit of concept driving the kind of visuals. As you'll notice, I'm clipping most of the images out pretty much freehand, again, just so that way it kind of feels a bit closer to kind of what you would do with traditional collage, actually using the scissors. And then once I've pasted them into the final file, there isn't too much that I do. I desaturate the images so that way they're all grayscale. I'll adjust the levels slightly so that way there's a bit more contrast, or at least that there's contrast in a way that I kind of want to have working. And then I'll apply a layer style with just a kind of a quick drop shadow. So again, a good example here with this eagle, just using the lasso tool to clip it out. So not a lot of kind of mechanical detail or precision going into the clip, because again, I think that just kind of adds to the overall collage aesthetic. Now, this is almost wrapping up, but one of the next images I'm going to start adding are these turtles, and it's kind of a good example of what I want to kind of touch on with collage. I don't use it that often, but one of the things I try to consider is, much like texture or just working with a limited palette in general, I try to have a bit of repetition so that way there isn't just kind of a feel of just kind of absolutely chaos. So by using the repeating visual of the turtles, it creates a bit more harmony within the collage in the background. And whether this is right or wrong or formally taught at all, who knows. But I will say that as far as how I approach collage, I try to have at least some repeating elements and some textural elements like the maps and that background house, so that way it isn't all trying to compete for attention. Now, as we're wrapping up, I will admit that I did make a few changes to the illustration after I finished the screen recording, so you might notice that the levels on the statue adjust, but overall this is pretty much it. So I think we're just going to save, and there it is. That's the final illustration. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out either in the comments or some other way. Thanks. Bye.